now to discuss the most recent developments is Ariel Braun. He's an international relations and political science professor with the University of Toronto. Good morning, Professor. Nice to see you. Let's begin with the UN. The vote continues to be postponed. How come? What are the main sticking points?
There's a hope that somehow there could be a consensus where what seems to be an intractable dilemma is solved. Hamas has committed some of the worst atrocities ever and started this war, and they are continuing to use civilians as human shields, and they have promised that they would repeat the same atrocities again and again if they stay in power. So how do you get to some kind of a truce where you bring in more humanitarian aid, but at the same time you do not allow Hamas to reconstitute itself to continue the war? Let's not forget that today dozens of rockets were fired from Gaza at Israel, that hundreds of thousands of people in Israel had to basically seek shelter because of continuing rocket fire. And this is what the world has to face. So it is not just a matter of virtue signaling. The loss of innocent civilian life in war is always a terrible tragedy. But how does one come to end a conflict in a way that it doesn't reconstitute new conflicts and new loss of life?
Hamas says it won't release any more hostages unless there is a full stop to the war. If you are trying to negotiate with Hamas, and let's be honest, right now there are no real talks, meaningful talks taking place, how do you position yourself against Hamas's stance right now?
This is what makes it so very difficult, because we know that Hamas has not kept its word on any ceasefire. There was a ceasefire on October 6th, broken by Hamas on October 7th, with the results we are all aware of. We know that when there was this temporary truce, Hamas again violated it. We know what their intent is, and as long as Hamas stays in power, it's not likely that there will be a resolution. This is why Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, said, and he said to allies, that you cannot have a situation where you demand that the victim of aggression, that is Israel, has to do certain things, abide by certain rules, but you do not also impose that on the aggressor. The consensus has been that Hamas has to be removed from power. And unless that is done, and they're not going to leave voluntarily, it is difficult to see how this conflict can end. And this is why we see this continuation, and it is terrible, and people are suffering. But Hamas does not seem to care about their own people. They are firing rockets from areas that were declared safe, and they have used schools and mosques and hospitals to position their weapons there. There's ample evidence that has been provided to journalists, to intelligence services, that this has been the case. And so this is the dilemma that is being faced, and this is why it's so difficult to find a resolution to this conflict. And no one has a magical solution. We could pretend that somehow this can all go away, but we know from fighting ISIS, we know from fighting terrorist organizations like this, Al-Qaeda, that this is a terrible, terrible conflict, and that it goes for a long time. And we have to therefore go back to the basics and ask ourselves, who is ultimately responsible for all this?
Right, and Blinken's point, to summarize, was that there needs to be more calling out of Hamas. Do you think, Ariel, as you lay out how long this could go on, that in the meantime Hamas is gaining more legitimacy?
Well, this is what we don't know in a conflict, because whenever there is a conflict, then there is an opaqueness, there is the fog of war. And we also get word that more and more people in Gaza are beginning to blame Hamas, but in the West Bank, because prisoners have been released, that can increase their popularity. So it is a very difficult situation for which no one has a resolution key. And so this kind of notion that, if you fight them, they become more popular, but if you don't fight them, they become more powerful, and they continue to kill people. And so what was done in the case of ISIS in Mosul, it took, sadly, something like 9 months to liberate Mosul from the ISIS terror, and there was a huge loss of life, which was certainly the fault of ISIS. And this is what also needs to be understood. This is not to say that Israel should not be as careful as possible in trying to save civilian lives. This is not to say that there should be no search to try to minimize civilian casualties. This is not to say that there should not be a movement to a different phase at some point where there will be more low-intensity conflict. All of those are perfectly valid points. But this kind of notion that we had with the General Assembly, where there was a vote which had no impact, but it basically did not even mention Hamas. It assigned no responsibility. It demanded no real obligations except sort of a throwaway line about hostages. That is not likely to lead to a resolution.
Right.
And this is why I suggested this is, at the moment, an intractable dilemma.
Well, we'll see what today's vote produces after the delay yesterday at the UN. Ariel Braun, thank you so much. Professor Braun is an international relations and political science professor with the University of Toronto.